Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 34, My Sister, the Serial Killer, by Oyinkan Braithwaite. Welcome back to Point Blank. My name is Kurt, and joining me as always is Justin. How are you doing today, Justin?
Oh boy, I'm doing all right. It's a good autumn afternoon, and I am functional. How are you? I feel like with our new schedules, it feels like it's eons between recording sessions.
Yes, it does, and we will have to come up with some plans here to get into a recording schedule that works with these new schedules we both have. So we're working on that, folks. But today we have an episode for you on Nigerian Noir, and I have to say, as a location, this is probably for me the most exciting place that we've visited so far in Point Blank. I really enjoyed some time with Nigeria and Lagos as a location. So, and to look at this genre of noir, we've picked My Sister, the Serial Killer, which is, in a lot of ways, it's very different than anything that we've looked at on the show, because one, it's almost brand new. Two, it's extremely popular with readers right now. And it also has our youngest author and one of the very few authors we've covered who is alive and well and continuing her career as a writer. So, very exciting book.
That's mighty praise from you to speak to Lagos as one of your best locations, given how much you loved spending time in Marseille. So that's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to, and we'll get into this in our subject unknown, but there's something to this location that just really, I don't know, place doesn't necessarily come through as strongly in this particular novel, but the other novels and stories that I read that took place in this location are, I don't know, there's a city here that has a lot going on. And it's an extremely interesting place for fiction. So, and in real life too, but it makes for great fiction. And we'll get to that in our subject unknown.
Totally. And I too have a not so secret infatuation with Lagos as a city. I've spent time long before we discussed this episode on Google Maps, just wandering around the streets of Lagos. I don't know what compels me. I think it's its grit, its massive size, its location, it's very Africanness and it's very metropolitan aspects, and there's so much I just don't know and I'm curious about in the city. So we'll get more into that when we talk Nigerian noir with subject unknown. But do you have anything you want to chat about? Anything worth sharing with us today at the beginning, Kurt?
Well, I did want to thank our listeners. Last time around, we had asked for some reviews on iTunes, and we did get a couple of reviews, so I appreciate that. I know we had one American listener and at least one UK listener who got on there and wrote a nice little review for us on the show. So if anybody else wants to do that, we sure would appreciate those positive reviews on iTunes. They do help, and they really do make me feel good about doing the show.
Yes, they also boost our self-esteem, and you don't know how much self-esteem goes into doing these volunteer type efforts. So keep them coming if you like what we're doing. Another thing I wanted to mention: this is our first episode since I hosted Noir at the bar in Albuquerque.
Yes, how did that go?
It was fucking awesome. It exceeded my expectations, and I tend to have low expectations as sort of a life-saving device. But we had a great group of readers at Tractor Brewing Company, Wells Park, just north of downtown Albuquerque. Over 60 folks showed up. The place was packed. Food was delayed by over an hour because of how many people were there, and they were understaffed. They hadn't anticipated the crowd surge. And neither did I, frankly. We were just hoping to not embarrass ourselves with the promotion. And no, that it was really good. Great readings, great ambiance, very noirish, dark lit. And a couple of things happened that were cool out of that. One is that a guy who was there, who was a crime writer from Santa Fe, he was talking to me after the event, and he's interested in setting up his own noir at the bar in Santa Fe, and I'm going to help him with that. So, energy, things rolling forward and new projects. And also, several of us were asked, a friend of mine or an associate who works at the community radio here in town, KUNM, he asked if we would mind reading some of our stories for the radio, for like a spoken word or noir radio hour. And we did that, and that aired a couple weeks ago. And that went really well too. And it was really cool to hear our stories. The spontaneity of our stories, made for one thing, shift over to something else and to get more of a readership that way. So I was really happy with the whole thing, and a lot of good energy came out of it. So impressed, and I'm glad I put in the effort to put that together, and I'm hoping that we can keep the ball rolling and have some more events similar to that in the future.
That's excellent. I'm just, it makes me really happy to hear that, and sad that I wasn't there to experience it, but the turnout, I mean, that alone, I mean, it's kind of hard to get 60 people to an event. You and I have certainly organized plenty of events in our past and put in a lot of effort, and you'd sometimes be lucky if you could get, a handful of people at something. So
totally.
There's obviously an interest in this in Albuquerque. So that's great.
Yeah. It made me feel real good. And, the other thing, the radio thing, they did record it, and it's going to be available on KUNM for posterity. So once that's actually released and out there, I'll let folks know in case anybody wants to check out some of the stories that were read at Noir at the Bar. So that's cool to have the posterity in addition to the event. So, but yeah, so it was an eventful start to the semester, end of summer, and now we're here. I also put out a record yesterday, 2 days ago. So if anybody wants to listen to my garage rock, I put out a record, 9-song affair. So that was another thing that I just blasted through and got done in the wake of my new job, which is very time consuming, and I have little time for creative outlet. So I do it when I can do it.
Well, Justin, what is the name of that band, and where is that available from?
Okay. The band's name is Fuguer's Cove. You won't be able to spell it, folks, Fuguers, because it's a made-up name. And you can find the album at fuguerscove1.bandcamp.com. You can also find it on my website, justinbendel.com. So if you want a link and see what I'm doing, I do this music for Point Blank, so you'll get a sense of, the kind of sounds I make. So it's lo-fi stuff. It's fun. It makes me happy.
Cool. Yeah, check that out if you want to hear more of Justin's music. So, all right. So should we move on into a summary of My Sister the Serial Killer?
I think so. And I'll start it off with my summary here. So we have a Nigerian author, Oyinkan Braithwaite, and the book is My Sister the Serial Killer. And this is a short crime novel. It was published in 2018 by Doubleday. The story is set in Lagos, which is the largest megalopolis on the African continent, though, as Kurt mentioned earlier, in this novel I wouldn't call Lagos a major character. And this was actually a surprise to me, given I have this weird fetish for Lagos and I wanted to see it, and there's not as much of it as you might think. However, this novel is more about the relationship between two, I'd say, upper middle class sisters. One works as a nurse in a local hospital, and the other is, or appears to be, a serial killer, hence the title. The setup is this. We have the protagonist, Korede. She works at the hospital and is the elder sister to Ayula, who is like the stereotypically hot sister who all the boys want, and she uses this to her advantage. She doesn't work. She has sort of a charmed life that she appears to take for granted. The problem and the initial tension in the story is that all her boyfriends keep disappearing, and Ayula recruits Korede to help with the cleanup and to help her, keep her tracks clean. So this is the initial setup. Some other characters that are essential to the plot. At the hospital, there's a young doctor named Tade Otumi, and Korede works with him and pines for him. He's charming in a way. He's this kind and giving doctor, and, in Korede's world, she would love to be his partner. Of course, this gets complicated because the always attractive Ayula shows up to the hospital and catches Tade's eye. And this is, in the first quarter of the book, essentially killing Korede's chances with Tade, and also setting up some of the tensions that fuel and drive the plot from beginning to end. There's another plot wheel aspect that is worth exploring or thinking about here is that at the hospital, Korede has a relationship with a coma patient named Mutar. And as a nurse, she of course caretakes for a living, but she's found a special purpose for Mutar. He listens, so she tells him the darkest secrets of her life. She tells him everything. Of course, this is a bit of a trope because there's only two ways for a narrative arc about a coma patient to go if it's going to keep the tension up. One is that Mutar can die, and the other is that he can wake up. And, of course, if he does wake up, what if he remembered everything Korede told him while in a coma, even the dangerous and questionable things she said? You can take a guess at which path Braithwaite decided to go. I'm not going to spell it out for you. So those are the setups, the basic premise, the major characters. The tone of the novel is darkly comic. The story is fast-paced. This is terse. Short chapters with titles for each chapter, like single-word titles. Some chapters are several pages long. Some are one sentence long. I love this type of stuff. I love doing it myself. I like playing with form in this way, and it's really well done here. And in terms of the narrative, the narrative starts at a point in time and moves forward. While the backstory is chronological, we hop to various points in the backstory to help us understand what's happening with the sisters and with the crimes and with the cover-ups. And the why. Why did this happen? Why is Ayula like she is, and why is Korede like she is? The backstory is important because it deepens our understandings of the sisters, who they were, and how they've come to be who they are. And a lot of this is tied to the sisters' late father, whose story and past abuse and his narrative arc to the point at which he died gives a lot of depth and added information and insight to help us understand these sisters and the plot. Essentially, the major dramatic question is this: will Korede continue to protect her sister, who very well may be a serial murderer, or will Korede give up on her sister in favor of her own personal interest and jealousy? And that tension is keeps the book really tight, keeps the narrative riveting, keeps us holding on and waiting to hear about how it's going to go. Here's what I'll say about this book: I liked it. I can't say I loved it. I think Braithwaite does a good job handling the tension between the sisters and the escalating tension over whether or not Ayula will be found out. We get to see, as the tension ramps up, a little bit of Lagos, and we get to see police corruption. We get to see some of the common threads that I've found to be the case in Nigerian noir. But at the end, I guess I really didn't care enough about either character as much as I would have liked to. Now, I get it. This is Noir 101. Unlikable characters are a given. However, Braithwaite is a debut novelist, and I think when it comes to crafting unlikable characters, I feel like they need to be likable enough to root for them despite flaws, like just unlikable enough to be unlikable, but to have that special something that keeps you, engaged and hopeful for them. Or they have to be so despicable that you fall in love with hating them. I feel like with Korede, it's close. Like, she's almost a character I want to root for, but I feel like a little bit more development would have helped for me, would have helped maybe hold my interest more completely. So at the end of the day, I think the ending is solid, and I'm not going to tell you the ending. I'm going to quit doing that. And I think Braithwaite did a good job in not being overly predictable with the way she crafted the tale. And so I'm going to give it a 4 stars. But I'll admit, I was thinking about 3.5 stars to start, and I moved it up to 4 because I did a bit of rereading, and I realized there's some real cool stuff in this book. And I understand why people like it, and I understand the value in having these Nigerian protagonists and characters and developing and understanding this crime world that doesn't get as much media, especially in the United States. That's changing, and that's good. But this isn't a 5-star book for me. What about you, Kurt?
As usual, I have to agree with a lot of the points that you made, and I would agree. For me, I'm going to say this is also a 4 out of 5 stars. It's a very strong 4. For a first novel, I think that there's a ton to love here. Some of their lines are just they're spot on perfect. The structure is great. I did like being in a new location. I liked that it felt like it was playing on some tropes of the classic serial killer type novel, but yet it had a lot of things that also made this feel fresh, with different voices and different locations and all of those wonderful things. And like you said, I can see why this is an extremely popular novel, and it deserves a lot of the praise that it's getting. It does have a couple of little things that that keep it from being a 5-star book, but it's still one I would highly recommend reading. It reads quick. It's fun. Like you said, it is darkly comedic at points. And I think some of the things that you brought up, and we'll get into this more in the meat of part 2 of this episode, but this wasn't, and I learned this in an interview with the author, this wasn't necessarily set up to be a genre fiction piece. I think part of that maybe comes through, as you said, with like the characters not being, unlikable enough or whatever for a noir character. But I mean, overall, I'm very impressed with the novel. I would have liked to have seen a little more of Lagos in the setting, but I feel like I did get that from other pieces of Nigerian crime fiction. So, I mean, if this brings more of a spotlight to Nigerian fiction, all the better, because it from what I've seen, it deserves that spotlight for sure. I know this one is just, it's a darling right now on book club lists and must-read books and all of that. It's really blown out of proportion to what Oyinkan thought it was going to do when she wrote it. She kind of wrote this as I'll just get a little small publisher and get out my first novel. She didn't expect this kind of attention for this book. But I highly recommend it. And I think we're going to see some quality novels from Braithwaite in the future.
I totally agree with that.
So yeah, I think we both highly recommend My Sister the Serial Killer,
Yeah.
and we'll look forward to looking at it with more detail in episode 35 of Point Blank.
Yeah, I'm sure we both have plenty to say on it, and I'm really biting my tongue trying not to dive right in now. So what we have next, before we get into discussing Nigerian noir in a general sense for Subject Unknown, we're going to do a featured review for you today. Our feature reviews are books that are sent to us by publishers or authors, and we don't pick and decide to review every one. It's a case-by-case basis, but I was really excited about reviewing this one, and it's very timely because it's a book that has not yet come out, at least at the time of recording, and it's due to come out in October 2019, and it's set in October at the cusp of Halloween. It's a Halloween hard-boiled crime tale. So I thought, being a Midwesterner and having a big interest and love for Halloween, I was pretty psyched about giving this book a read, and Kurt agreed. So, Kurt, would you like me to start off by giving a bit of a review of the book before we dive in and share our thoughts?
Sure, let's do that.
Okay. The name of the book is called Blood Sugar, and it's written by Daniel Kraus. Some of you might know that name. I wouldn't consider him a regular in the world of crime fiction, but he's actually crafted a pretty established career in the realm of fiction and screenwriting. He was one of the writers of The Shape of Water, which won Best Picture in 2018. He's also been pegged to write the unfinished novel of George A. Romero, a.k.a. Night of the Living Dead. So this guy has some cachet. And my question going in is, well, Hard Case Crime is putting out his book, Blood Sugar, and I wondered if this prestige of his is going to translate into crime fiction. And frankly, I thought it did pretty well, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The way that Hard Case is trying to sell this book is that it's a Halloween nightmare from the co-creator of The Shape of Water. Would you call this a Halloween nightmare, Kurt? Would you agree with that? Or is that a loaded question?
Okay, so let me throw out one of the. I really did enjoy this as well for the most part, but let me throw one of the things that I have sort of a problem when it comes to Hard Case Crime is they have this very stylistic element to all of their covers, which of course goes back to this like classic vein of crime fiction, right?
Sure.
And the art style, the layout, and all of that. So you see that cover and you kind of get something in your head. And this is very much not that kind of story.
Aha. So you felt like, in this case, the cover lured you in, but it didn't quite translate to the text itself.
Correct. And I, I don't want that to, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover and all of that. But I was a little thrown off when I started this, but once I got rolling, it's like, yeah, this, it is Halloween crime fiction tale. I wouldn't call this a nightmare, because a nightmare sort of implies a degree of horror or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't that type of crime story. This is more of the dysfunctional, sort of related to druggy fiction, I guess. Than it is anything else. Now, once you realize what this is, and I kind of shifted gears, then I really started to enjoy the novel.
Interesting. It's funny because I don't recall, I never really looked at the cover. I guess I have a blind eye and I just went into the text. So I didn't have that prejudgment. I thought it was going to, I had the words, Halloween nightmare, but I didn't have the imagery to seduce me or trick me. But yeah, I wouldn't say that it is a nightmare either. It is, in a lot of way, an entirely different type of story. And yes, there is crime involved, and there is violence, and there's a hard-boiled quality to the narrative. But let me introduce the characters and the basic plot so our readers know a little bit of what we're talking about. This is like set, in my head, this is set in a medium-sized Rust Belt city. It has that feel, and it may or may not be true. There's Jody. Jody's our protagonist. He's a short, 14-year-old kid who postures like a badass, but he has a soft heart, and you see that consistently in the story. He's a terrifically amusing narrator. I love hanging out with Jody and listening to him just spiel about anything. He drops Lord of the Ring references almost every page. He's practicing how not to swear, so he uses weird phrases like Mighty Duckin' and Shark Week and RoboCop to punctuate his sentences, all over the place. And Kraus writes Jody's narration phonetically at times, and it's super slangy. So if you're not really into that, it might take some getting used to. But for me, it was a real fun ride. I love when I can tell that a writer is having fun and that it translates well on the page. Jody is vulgar and sweet in equal portions, and I was perfectly on board with having him carry me through the story. 3 other major characters, and I'm going to briefly mention them. Midge is Jody's foster sister. She's a junkie of sugar and a bug lover, and I think she's like a kindergartner. I'm not sure. That's what it feels like. Robbie is a 20-something with a glorious and tragic past in high school football. He owns a house on Yellow Street. The house is in total dilapidated squalor, and he's this 20-something, but he hangs out with these kids. He hangs out with Jody and Midge, and also this gal named Dag, short for Dagmar, who is a teenager in high school. She's a high-achieving high school kid with great grades and a good home from the rich side of town. But she has a sister in a mental institution, so that's her tension and her suffering, I guess, comes from that. And Jody has a total unrequited crush on her. Would you say that Dag is slumming with these other guys on Yellow Street?
Yeah, I would think. That's kind of the definition of slumming, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a deliberate slumming. She's engaging with these people because she feels that they understand her and they know her, and in a sense, this is a big family of outcasts and people who are looking for something they're not getting in their own lives, the lack of love from the family and all that. But so we have these people all together, and you get to see their weirdness, their drug use, how this guy Robbie is entirely inappropriate with these kids, but it's not totally offensive. He's not like a child molester or anything creepy, but he does give them drugs and treats them like equals and adults, and will buy pills, a medley of pills, uppers, downers, whatever, and throw them in a blender with milk, which is called a supermilk, and everybody drinks the supermilk and then passes out and wakes up in random places, and the little girl Midge is having a seizure in the bathtub. It's in a sense, that's the nightmare. The nightmare is these kids are so desperate to have some kind of connection that this to them is it. This is as good as it gets. But it's fascinating. And the plot essentially is that it's almost Halloween. Robbie's had a rough go at it, and he had a bad history. He was a football player and a star, but then there was some sexual molestation from a coach, and then a big cover-up, which is sort of reminiscent of Penn State and all that stuff with Joe Paterno. And then he sort of, to break out of this feeling like he's being silenced by these people in power, he, after a touchdown, he goes to the star coach, the superstar coach that everybody loves, and beats the living shit out of him and ruins this guy's life. So the town hates him and he becomes the pariah, and his family leaves him. So he has this house and he's abandoned and nobody loves him anymore. So he wants to get back at the town by spiking the candy, the classic poison candy scenario, and actually give out candy to all the town's children and ruin people's lives. And that's the premise. Now, there's other things, but that's pretty much it. I mean, would you say that that's the plot?
Yeah, I mean, the plot's very basic. I mean, a group of misfits are going to poison candy and give it out to the kids for Halloween to get back at the adults in the city. That's the plot.
That's it.
No, yeah, we know that from the get-go, and
yep.
They stay on that track, sort of.
Yeah, and that's the pacing of the story is to set up to the big explosion on Halloween. Now, we might say we'll have a couple things to say about the end, but for me, this was more about the ride than the end. I just enjoyed spending time with these lovable weirdos in their twisted little community, their little family core, and the stuff they did and the way they did it. Going to Walgreens repeatedly to buy random things like poison and candy. Like, it's a very pedestrian, very, run-of-the-mill story about people scraping by on the wrong side of the tracks. The voice in this, I'm gushing about this story because I really genuinely, until the last 20 pages, I loved it. I loved the voice. I would go with Jody anywhere. It was the ending that I feel like Kraus just dropped the ball. Like, it was rushed. Loose ends were not tied up suddenly. It felt like Kraus got distracted by some other big project and forgot to complete the character arcs. It was like the story just ran out of steam at the end, and it was just confusing given how attracted I was to the characters and where their stories were going, and just spending time with them. I don't know what happened there. Would you agree that something happened in the last 20 pages?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, as you've implied through this is a book that is about the journey, not necessarily the destination. And I think once you, like I said, it took me a few pages to get into it, but once you get the style of the narration from Jody, it's a really delightful book. I mean, maybe delightful is quite the wrong word there, because as you said, you called it vulgar and sweet. And I had written down it was funny and gross, because in many ways, the descriptions in here grossed me out more than some of the more grisly, murder books we've looked at. And, it's about that narration that is really the joy of this book. But I wanted to throw in the Halloween reference because I do feel like this book is a little bit of a trick or treat. The treat is the narration. The treat is that journey is spending time with Jody and this gang of kids, really. But the trick is the ending, as you said. It doesn't finish strong at all, really, and it might work for some people. I don't want to tell people not to read this book because of that ending, because I think there is so much to enjoy here. But you're right. It feels like it was unfinished. I almost felt like it could have been snipped off and left as a something hanging would have been a better ending than the way that this ends. It did feel a little incomplete. However, the quality of the narration is just it's a voice unlike anything we've certainly covered on this show. And it's very unique in that regard, and I would recommend it for that alone. If you want a highly suspect narrator who's enjoyable to listen to, and as you said, the Lord of the Rings references. Now that seems, in some ways that maybe that might be a little, I don't know, cliche or something, but it really works. It works well, and it's an interesting pairing with this, as you said, sort of like kid trying to be sort of street tough at the same time. Mm-hmm. It's a great pair.
Yeah, I mean, the kid Jody, he's not some casual LOTR fan. his references are pretty deep, and they don't just reference the movie, they reference the book as well. He has a sweatshirt with a Lord of the Rings quote on it. Like, he's a devotee. So it adds an element of, he's like so sincere in his passion. It humanizes him. And so much about the stories, about these characters are really human. And, you know, Kurt, we were just talking about it off the mic, how the more crime fiction we read, the more we understand just how much of it isn't very good. You know, there's so much crime fiction, and we started with like all the classics, and some of them we loved and some of them less so. But the more we read, the more we realize how easy it is to be a mediocre crime writer. And so when I come across a narrative that feels fresh to me or new, I'm in love. Like, I'm like, thank you. I want to feel this feeling again, and not to just glaze over. And this book is such a study of character and voice that I would read it again in a heartbeat just to be with these four outcasts. Now, crime fiction purists might argue that it's all about plot, and if you can't land the ending, it's like a amazing gymnastics routine where you just crumble onto the mat. But the thing is, yes, it is often about plot, except when it's not. And I think this is one of those books that for me is an exception. I don't really care about how Halloween goes. It's all about the buildup and how these characters behave en route to that moment. So I would call this in the end that despite the end being mediocre, this is a mighty ducking good read, and I would recommend it, especially this time of year.
Yep. So just mix yourself up a nice supermilk and grab blood sugar and
oh my God.
Go for an enjoyable. I mean, you're right. It is. Despite what I had to say about the ending and my concerns about this is really one of the most unique, enjoyable books I've read for the show in a while. And I just wish Kraus had stuck that ending a little bit more, because, you know, I enjoyed The Shape of Water, and I also have to mention that he was behind the film Troll Hunters, which is probably one of my favorite movies. So
awesome.
Check out Blood Sugar, coming out this October from Hard Case Crime.
Totally.
Before we move into our subject unknown, I just wanted to take a minute and just kind of talk about a couple of crime fiction related TV shows and things that I've been looking at. Not a full review or anything, but just some stuff I wanted to recommend. A mini series kind of show that's on Netflix that I watched. We don't talk a lot about spy fiction on here, but we should probably do an episode on spy fiction at some point.
Totally.
And this one is just called The Spy, and it stars, of all people, and this is why I had to check it out, it stars Sacha Baron Cohen of Borat fame. Yeah, and at first I was like, what? But this is a serious piece. It's based on true events about a spy, an Israeli spy who infiltrates Syria back in the 60s. You know, at first glance, Cohen seems like an odd choice for a spy. But when you think about the type of comedy that he does, where he immerses himself in these characters and then tries to fool people into, you know, saying things they might not normally say, that's actually a pretty good actor to play a spy. And he has this double life of being this essentially businessman who gets into Syria and tries to impress people high in the government and get all this information for the Israeli government. There are some problems with the show. I didn't think that the part, especially his home life part in Israel, was particularly well depicted. I didn't see necessarily the motivations for the character to get as deep in the spying as he did in real life. But the portion of the show that details this character, who I forget what his first name was, but the actual spy's last name was Cohen. I did not find if there's a family connection there, but he does such a great job playing this other personality who is the guy who infiltrates Syria. And it's quite amazing how deep he gets into it. And you do find out right at the beginning, and if you looked at history, you'd also know that this guy is killed. He is found out and killed, but the level of how deep he gets is quite interesting. So I would recommend the Spy. I think it's only a 6-part series, so it's not a huge commitment.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I would recommend it. And then the other thing that is crime related that I've been going down this path of being really interested in art history lately. And part of that comes from really two things. One, I find art crimes very interesting, art theft, and also forgery. And some of that comes from I've been listening to the podcast Empty Frames, which covers the Elizabeth Stewart Gardner Museum heist in Boston about 20 some years ago. And that is the largest art crime ever, where they stole all these paintings and they have not been recovered. And they're basically trying to uncover new information in the hopes that maybe somebody will come forward with these paintings. But that led me to the show, the BBC show Fake or Fortune, which is people bring these paintings to these experts and they think they might be from some master or whatever. And then they try to prove or disprove whether or not that painting is legitimate or not. And I just find that element fascinating of, what creates value, the dark side of the art market as far as the forgeries go, the whole history of World War II and stolen paintings and all of that kind of stuff gets brought up in that show. And I also did read a novel called The Art Forger, which sort of is connected to the Elizabeth Stewart Gardner heist. But if you ever wanted to learn how art is forged, that novel would be a little bit of a textbook in how that's done, because it gets into some of the gritty details of faking a painting. As a novel, it's not bad, but it's not really the type of crime novel we would cover on this show. But if that sort of thing is interesting to you, you could check out The Art Forger.
I feel like there's a career for you in the future, man. I think you're sort of nosing around it and not quite admitting you have a bright career as a forger ahead of you. Just got to apply yourself.
Maybe if I could draw anything besides stick figures, there might be something there. But no, I think I will just be watching from the sidelines. But I do find it fascinating. It's been a long time since I brought up a game on the podcast, but there is a new board game. First edition came out and it was sold out, but I have found out there's going to be a new printing, but it's called Detective City of Angels. And I looked some stuff up on YouTube and it's really a pretty game. Basically, I don't want to simplify it too much, but it's almost a very advanced version of Clue. One player is sort of like not really the thief, but kind of like the person who knows what's going on behind the scenes with the case. And then the rest of the players play as detectives and they go around locations in Los Angeles and you get to question suspects and figure out the motive, the means, and all of that, and solve these cases in the board game. It looks like a lot of fun. I've ordered a copy of the second edition, and then it unlike Clue, where you just kind of like mix the cards up, and figure out who it is, there are actually different cases. So there's expansions and whatnot, and the cases look pretty interesting. There's a lot of nods, as you would expect, to noir fiction. And if I get it on the table, I'll be sure to update you all as to whether or not it's good. But it's got a ton of great reviews, so I'm looking forward to that Detective City of Angels.
That sounds like fun. I love Clue, the game, and I love Clue, the movie. And hell, it's a murder mystery. I never really think about it like that as essential to crime fiction as it is. And so, yeah, I do want a full report on that game. That sounds like a Clue plus a few extra layers.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to it.
Subject unknown!
Subject unknown!
Nigerian Noir in Lagos, Nigeria, the capital city. I have a quote here that I'd be not bad to share. It's from Chris Abani, who did the editing for the Lagos Noir Akashic book, Kurt.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so this is Chris Abani talking about Lagos. And here's the quote. Lagos has, like many coastal cities, a very checkered and noir past. It is the largest city in Nigeria and its former capital. Oh yeah, that's right. It's not the capital. It's now just the largest city. It is also the largest megacity on the African continent, with a population approximating 21 million, and by itself is the fourth largest economy in Africa. Though named by the Portuguese, Lagos means lakes in Portuguese. The city was also known briefly as Onim. Because of the many islands and lagoons that make up its sprawl, it has since had so much land reclaimed from the city for its expansion that it bears no resemblance to that time. Its pronunciation, with its subsequent British history, has been anglicized. Surest way to annoy a Lagosian is to call it by its Portuguese pronunciation. So we don't want to annoy any Lagosians, so we will do our best to enunciate properly. The city of Lagos, not Lagos. He sort of gives us a sense of the city as this massive, sprawling, like 21st century behemoth, a massive economy, tons of people, but classic noir elements in place. And I read Lagos Noir, and I read this great book by Braithwaite, but the other books on my shelf that I was hoping to get to, I didn't really get to. So I imagine that you read a little bit more than me, Kurt, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on how Lagos and Nigeria look on the page, and if you were able to deduce anything, some themes about the way these places are written.
I'm loving the fiction that I'm seeing coming out of Nigeria and Lagos in particular. And man, there's so many elements going on here in the city, in the country, that provide, and we've talked about this in the past, about how areas of conflict and change are going to create good crime fiction. Now, that might not necessarily be the best for the residents who live there, but it does give us a lot to work with when it comes to fiction. And like I said, there's like your quote suggests, it's like there's just, it's such a massive city. And I heard quotes, that's basically said that Lagos, people who've lived in Lagos and they move to a place like New York City makes New York feel like a small town. And even that figure, and I ran across that too, of 21 million. I've also seen reports that it might be as high as 30 million people who live there. They really don't have a good census of of how many people live in this city. And there's just so many things that I looked at a number of different sources. Yes, I read a handful of books. I looked at that same Lagos Noir book that you did. I looked at a few articles. I also rewatched the Anthony Bourdain episode on Lagos, which is a great episode if you like that show. Not only that, I really enjoyed the editing. It really gives you a sense of what the city must feel like. And I think he does a really good job of exploring this huge contradiction between the enormous wealth that is in Lagos and the enormous poverty that is also in Lagos. There's millions and millions of people in Lagos who are living on less, like I think it was $1.25 a day or something like that. But you also have a city in which I believe there's more billionaires in Lagos than certainly all the rest of Africa, but it was even bigger than that. And why is that? Well, it's a trading hub. Nigeria is a country that has oil.
Uh-huh.
It has a booming and emerging tech industry. It is the third largest producer of films in the world in what they call Nollywood. So behind Hollywood, Bollywood, then there's Nollywood.
Huh. That's cool. I did not know that.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting culture going on there, and it's a country that has a pretty dark history, really, and a dark history that we don't even have to go back that far. There's 300 different ethnic groups, at least, in Nigeria. The blend, as you can imagine, that blend, the type of culture that all comes together there. You're going to see all sorts of different things, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But I also read, a book by
Leye Denley.
Yeah, he talks a little bit about the genre fiction has always been popular in Nigeria, and particularly in Lagos. And part of that is because, whether we like it or not, Nigeria was a British colony from 1800 to 1960. So English is at least a primary or secondary language or an even language with a lot of people, especially people in Lagos, or the people who are taking advantage of that British school system that was there. And there's some elements of that I'm not going to go into right now. So genre fiction has always been popular there. And up until recently, that genre fiction has mostly been from the West and brought into Nigeria. But there is also a culture of their own action thrillers from the 70s. That's kind of, where this film market came out of that. And he says, Adenle says, why Legos? Legos is the kind of character any writer would want in their story. Larger than life, flawed, conflicted, dramatic, driven, consistent, and yet unpredictable. A character with agency. He goes on to call it a harmony of contrasts and contradictions. It's brutal, capitalist, man eats dog, dog eats man, everything eats everything else. And his fiction, which was, we're doing a book of his in our Goodreads group.
Easy Motion Tourist.
Yes. Say that one more time.
Easy Motion Tourist by Leah Denley.
Yeah, we're looking at that as a group read in our Goodreads group for the podcast. But I read the second book in that series, and man, that one really evoked the city more than in My Sister, the Serial Killer. It really spoke to the type of city that Legos is. It talked a lot about the different class conflicts, the different neighborhoods, the political intrigue that goes on there. It's and everybody who is that I've talked to who's or seen interviews from Nigeria will mention the corruption. Corruption is king there. It is a fact of life. That is a big issue with Nigeria, and what some people claim Nigeria could be as powerful of a country as it would be like the China of Africa or the US of Africa or something if they could just kind of get that corruption under control. At least that's what a lot of people have said. And boy, is there ever a lot of factions in Nigeria, especially once you get even within Lagos and outside of Lagos. We can't forget things like the oil industry that's going on in the Nigerian Delta, the militants out there fighting for their land against the oil companies. You've got Boko Haram up in the north.
Yeah.
There was a civil war in the late 60s and the
Biafra.
70s, which was Biafra, which was awful.
Yeah.
There's so much going on in Nigeria. I mean,
Ken Saro-Wiwa.
Yeah.
In the 90s, martyr for the cause of democracy and confronting power. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned tension or conflict in that Leah Denley quote. I mean, just thinking about the religious stakes, the strong, not on top of like layers in incredibly diverse peoples and with different cultures and religion of Africa. You have the layer of Christianity, which has a strong foothold in the region. But then on the northern edge, we have the colonial Christianity, then we have the colonial Islam, and that's the Boko Haram, and then the infighting in the conflict just on religious grounds in the cities and in the surrounding regions. And that's not even looking at class, that's not even looking at power, that's not even looking at colonizing businesses and things like the oil industry. Just there's in any way you look, there's a place of conflict or a way to stir up conflict. It doesn't seem to take much, which for fodder for crime fiction. I mean, you could probably write 1 billion books about Nigeria and always have something original to say, given how much is going on and how much is on the surface.
Yeah, and I think that's what probably came through in my listing of issues is there is just so much. It's overwhelming in a sense. I work with a couple of guys who at least spent their childhoods in Nigeria, and I didn't really get in depth with them about the politics or whatever. But when you'd ask those sorts of questions, a lot of times they just kind of like shake their head. Like, I mean, they're like, it's just, I can't explain, basically saying I can't explain it. It's just too, it's too crazy. And that comes through in the fiction. I asked them a little bit about it, and really the only thing that they would tell me is that, the city is as chaotic as it appears in both the fiction and in things like the Bourdain episode. And there's a weird political element to Nigeria, and I'm not entirely sure why this comes from. You have all these people living in Lagos, but for whatever reason, the North controls the politics. And I never didn't find a good understanding of why that is, because it doesn't make sense population wise. But, when I talk to, and all the guys that I've worked with have all been from somewhere in southern Nigeria. and they will just kind of shake their heads and say, well, the people in the North are crazy. And that's about it. And that is where Boko Haram is located, or has their stronghold. And I also listened to a podcast. It's called War Nerd Radio. It's a podcast you can only listen to with a subscription, but they had a very lengthy discussion of current Nigerian politics and a little bit on Boko Haram. And one of the things that's interesting, you brought up the religious element. And not only do you have the Christian and Islamic faiths, but of course you have the traditional beliefs as well, which are often merged with Islam or Christianity to sort of form their own
syncretism, syncretic religions, fusion religions.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things about the more fundamentalist Islam that has led to these conflicts in the North is that's relatively new for Nigeria. That was not the Islamic faith that was prevalent until like starting in the late 70s and 80s is when a more fundamentalist version moved into Nigeria, and that's when some of the conflicts with that have started, and this Boko Haram has emerged. So that changing nature of the society is also, you know, a huge deal as these things change, I guess. But
totally,
it's hard to keep up is really, you know. And when I was listening to that podcast, and when I talked to, you know, these guys at work, it's like these people are from there, in this case they're experts on Nigeria, and they have trouble keeping up with what the latest developments are.
I can imagine it just being an overwhelming experience to spend a week or two in Lagos. I would love to do it. It's one of my dream explorations. We mentioned other, religions and ethnicities, the Igbo and the Yoruba, but there's many more than that. As a place, it's just such a palimpsest of things happening and people and conflicting desires and visions. And I mentioned before that in the Braithwaite story, which we'll talk about in the next episode, we don't get nearly as much of this as I would have expected, given what I've read elsewhere. For example, in the Lagos Noir book from Akashic, man, some of those stories are so they're overwhelming. You know, they're trying to, because the writer's trying to capture what Lagos might feel like. You look one way and you win some money. You look another way, a cop takes it out of your hands. You look another way, you know, something good happens again. You look another way, you know, it's like in every direction. You blink and something new is happening, and that energy and that wildness, and that's what I expect and feel like might be a theme in the fiction, that just the overall presence, that overwhelming presence of the city and the city that never sleeps, like New York, uber New York, you know. In reading novels, which you've read, I think at least one, if not a couple more than I have, set in Lagos, did you get a sense of the city in that sort of overwhelming sort of kinetic wildness? Or
oh yes
okay.
For sure. I mean, I think that comes through in the Lagos Noir book that you read as well. And I have to say that's one of the better collections from Akashic that I think we've run across.
Totally.
Yeah, it's very good. But also the Easy Motion Tourist and the second one in the series, When Trouble Sleeps, is the second book, and that just came out this year. But man, that really, it really captures location. Much more than my sister does. And it really comes through. I mean, I don't know that this is a place, like if you weren't from there and you tried to write Lagos, I don't know that you could pull it off, or it wouldn't come off as believable, because somebody would say, well, it can't be that, it can't be that chaotic. But for a writer who's actually from there to pull it off, I think it's still a huge challenge, but it definitely comes through in that fiction.
Cool. I really look forward to reading more Nigerian noir. My appetite has been very much whet by Braithwaite's book, and you mentioned it, but she's done a great service. The fact that her debut novel has exploded, it brings a lot of new eyes on fiction that might be overlooked. There's been a lot of Nigerian writers writing really good work, sci-fi, futurist fiction set in Africa, a lot of good crime fiction in the classic mystery sense, but also some of this evocative, fast-paced, hard-boiled crime stuff. There's tons of people, tons of great writers, and I really feel like they're starting to get major exposure in areas, places where they might have been unheralded in the past. So I'm really excited about spending more time in Nigeria and trying to understand it at least through the literature.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the benefits we have as well, at least as American readers, is the writers are writing in English, so we don't have to worry about translation being a factor. And I am very impressed with the Nigerian fiction that I've read so far. And I think our listeners would, if you haven't checked this stuff out, do it, because there's some good writing going on here.
This is the treasure trove I was hoping to find as we set off
Yes.
around the world. Like where is the writing coming from, and where are our blind spots? Nigeria was definitely one of the blind spots. I'm so impressed and so excited about all this writing that awaits me. So great. I'm looking forward to more. Maybe down the road, episode 300, we'll come back to Nigeria.
Sounds good. Well, before we close out this episode, I wanted to give a brief biography of Oyinkan Braithwaite. And I don't have a lot to say here because, well, like I said earlier, I mean, she's the youngest author that we've covered. This is her first full-length novel. And we also like to not dig as deep into authors who are still alive. So here's a little bit of a rundown. She was born in 1988 in Lagos. She spent her childhood, her family moved when she was around 10, I believe, to the UK on the north side of London. And she did go back, and she's been back and forth to Lagos her entire life. So she has a lot of recent experience with the city. She's worked as an editor prior to publishing this novel. She was also a poet from early on, and I think that comes through very strongly in this novel. This book has already won a number of awards. It's won the LA Times Award for Best Crime Thriller, the Morning News Tournament of Books. It was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction and longlisted for the Booker Prize. Braithwaite is also a graduate of the creative writing program at Surrey University, and she has a law degree from Kingston University. So I think we can expect to see a lot from her. This book it was optioned for a movie before it was even released by the producers of Baby Driver.
Damn.
This has just exploded, and I think we can hope to see a lot from Braithwaite in the future.
Totally. And we'll be talking more about this book in great depth in part 2. In terms of what's coming up, outside of part 2 of this episode, which will be out in a couple weeks after this release, we're still in the midst of our Noir Around the World tour, which felt like it was going to be quick, but we realized it's going to take up most of the year. Episodes 35 and 36, we head to Japan to spend time with Natsuo Carino's Out. And then we have the next 4 episodes. 2 of them are in Brazil. We're going to be with Gage Layton in Sao Paulo, and then we move on and hang out with Paco Taibo in Mexico City. I'm super psyched about that. I love Mexico City. It's another city with that sort of vivacious, never-ending, never sleeps, massive megalopolis, zeal that Lagos represents. So, and then from there we have to figure out what we're doing when we get back to the States. And me and Kurt are coming up with some ideas for that, including some sci-fi noir maybe.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm definitely looking forward to continuing our voyage around the world. I did want to mention, I think we did pick the actual book for Brazil, and that's Blood of the Wicked. If you want to get in touch with the show, you can find us on Facebook at Point Blank, Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction. You can send us an email at pointblanknoir@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at pointblanknoir.
Spread the word. If you like the show, we said it before, give us a rating on iTunes. This stuff really helps us, makes us feel good. It also helps us in the ratings so that more people can catch sight of the show and give it a listen. And if you have any friends left who are into this type of thing, budding crime fiction enthusiasts, let them know about the show. Tell them to tune in.
Or people who just like international fiction.
Yeah, or people who just like books or are bored and just want to listen to strangers talk to them.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Take care, folks.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.